Thank you very much for that gracious introduction, and really, Rajesh Nair, really touched by your very kind words. Also, M.S.A. Kumar, distinguished Shyam Srinivasan, Azad Mupan, Ajit Mupan, members of TiE and TiECON, including my old friend Arun Kumar, who first dragged me onto the TiE stage in Silicon Valley at the very first or second TiE. So I go back a long way with all of you. In fact, not only did you do that, and I'm just remembering, you also roped me into addressing the first ever TiE Calcutta with a communist chief minister alongside me, at which Buddhadev Bhattacharya made the news-making statement that some people in my party say globalization is bad, but I say that you have to live with it, or words to that effect, which became big news at the time. So now I'm remembering you've actually connected me to a lot of TiE efforts, but clearly, judging by the audience here, by the extremely impressive gentleman on the stage, should have been at least a lady or two really as well, but I think TiE has clearly got off to a very impressive start, and I'm happy to be with all of you today on this rather beautiful morning in Kochi. I mean, I might have been in Delhi, where the air is unbreathable, so one celebrates being an MP from Kerala on occasions like this. And I know this is the largest gathering of entrepreneurs in our state, so that's also very satisfying. And over the next couple of days, I believe you will both engage in important and fruitful discussions and on promoting the entrepreneurial climate of Kerala, as well as have an opportunity to discuss in substance some of the challenges and prospects that entrepreneurship faces here. I understand that some of you have come from other parts of the state, some of you have come from other countries. And together, I hope that your sessions and your interaction at TiECON Kerala 2017, you will discover and reaffirm the unique opportunities and potential that Kerala offers to become the next entrepreneurial hub of our country. Yesterday, November 9th, was National Entrepreneurship Day. I don't know how many of you knew that. I didn't know it either until yesterday when I saw it in the newspapers. But I think that's a good sign that we finally are waking up to the importance of this kind of entrepreneurship. After all, it wasn't long ago, certainly the India in which some of us here grew up, was very much an India where entrepreneurship was not just not celebrated, it was actively discouraged. And as somebody who has been dwelling in the past in my last book, I found myself explaining to young people that if you don't know where you've come from, how will you ever appreciate where you're going? And I think I may want to start there again also with all of you, because in the first 4 decades after our independence, when entrepreneurship obviously was not the flavor of the season, we had gone the other way. Self-reliance and economic self-sufficiency were our mantra. Entrepreneurship was not being encouraged. There was very much strong pressure towards a more and more closed economy. And it's partially because in those days, whereas in those days in the Western countries like America, people associated capitalism with freedom, in India, capitalism was associated with slavery. Why? Because, of course, the British East India Company had come to trade and stayed on to rule. And so our nationalists assumed that any foreigner with a briefcase must be the thin end of a neo-imperial wedge. That they say they want to trade with you or they want to invest here, what they really want to do is to rule you. And therefore the assumption was the only way that they could protect the political independence they had fought so long and hard for 200 years was by protecting their economic independence. And so the entire approach was predicated on keeping out capital, keeping out foreign trade, keeping out foreign investment, and instead of integrating our country into the global capitalist system, which only a handful of post-colonial countries like Singapore chose to do, our leaders rather kept ourselves in an increasingly closed economic system Self-reliance became the slogan, the protectionist barriers went up, and as we all know, India spent the first 45 years after independence with bureaucrats rather than businessmen on the commanding heights of the economy, spending those 4.5 decades in subsidizing unproductivity in the public sector, regulating stagnation, and trying to distribute poverty, which only went to prove that one of the lessons you can learn from history is that history can also teach you the wrong lessons. Now, with the reliance on the state as the engine of all progress, a great deal of entrepreneurial energy was drained from the economy. But with the liberalization that began in 1991, India has experienced a significant change. I think it started one could argue, with an act of political entrepreneurship, that the risk taken by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao in empowering his finance minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, to step out there and open up the space. And Manmohan Singh's historic words in the budget speech of 1991, when he said, paraphrasing Victor Hugo, that no power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come, that, I think, gave us a tremendous change, which has led to the boost in entrepreneurship today. A country once hindered by structure and regulation, a country which is either largely statist or family business run, as far as the economy was concerned, transformed into a nation which encourages entrepreneurship and innovation. In fact, to fast forward to the recent present, the 2015 Forbes magazine listed 5 Indian entrepreneurs in their top 100 richest list, 23 Indians in their top 500 list, and it's very clear that we've metamorphosed from a nation that was hesitant and even prejudiced towards the concept of entrepreneurship and business, because profit in those days was seen as a bad word, synonymous with greed. Now we are seen as a nation that enables entrepreneurs, and certainly in many parts of North India, greed is no longer considered a bad word either. So things have changed a lot in the approach. Now, what is noteworthy is how Indian entrepreneurship has transformed the country. And it's not really just since 1991. That's been the sea change. But if you go back to the handful of examples from earlier eras, you can actually get the flavor of this change. One of my favorite stories remains that of how Jamshedji Tata in the 1890s was denied admission to the whites-only, I think it was Pike's Hotel. There's some historical dispute. Some versions say Pike's, some say Watson's. But either way, he was thrown out. They had a sign outside saying Indians and dogs not allowed. So he went off and established, as an entrepreneur, a bigger, grander, more opulent hotel, the Taj Mahal, which is today one of the finest hotels in the world, while the hotel that threw him out is long since closed. So in the Taj Mahal Hotel, of course, Indians were admitted. I don't know what happened to the poor dogs. But the message was really that fair enough, if you won't let us into your enterprises, we are capable of starting our own. In fact, when Tata tried to set up India's first modern steel mill, the British had destroyed our traditional steel industry. They had, of course, kept a monopoly to themselves. And when he tried to, they threw up every conceivable regulatory obstacle in order to prevent him setting up a mill. He took over 20 years to get the necessary permissions. And in fact, he died in the attempt, because he finally got the permissions while he was alive, began setting up the plant. But the first steel sheets rolled off under his son's watchful eye, the Rabji Tatas. But when Tata was trying to do this, a senior colonial official, the then chairman of the railway board, sneered that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. I only wish that he had lived long enough to see the descendants of the same Jamshedji Tata purchasing the remnants of British steel when they acquired Chorus a few years ago. I think it might have given him a bad case of indigestion. So the point is that Indians have been able to demonstrate over a period of time their ability to take on the entrepreneurial challenges that the globe throws up. In fact, some of you will remember, quite unrelated to this story, the WhatsApp meme that went around when David Cameron was re-elected Prime Minister. I know he's now history, but that was when I saw these pictures going around saying British Prime Minister goes to Buckingham Palace in an Indian car, because of course he was being driven in a Jaguar, and what is more, escorted by British police in a Land Rover, both of which of course are owned by the Tata. So I tell these stories because obviously India has done well for itself in the entrepreneurship front. The repressed spirit of innovation has found wings, and now we see that India has also come up with its own innovative manner in entrepreneurship. The sort of desi term is what we call jugaad in northern India. More politely, I think one can speak of frugal innovation. If you were to Google the words frugal innovation, I think you'll find that the first 20 hits all relate to Indian innovations. And though Indian entrepreneurs are doing sufficiently well on a macroeconomic scale, the fact is that if you leave those indicators aside and look at the micro level, you'll find that we have entrepreneurs doing all sorts of interesting and creative things in very, very many different ways. And we've become natural leaders in frugal innovation because this challenge of developing makeshift solutions which are workable from limited resources in a resource-scarce environment has underpinned much Indian entrepreneurship. Of course, our frugal innovation is also seen by many foreign observers as almost conveying an attitude to life, a way of life, a worldview, that is the Indian habit of making do with what you have to meet your needs. And that may have gone a little too far. But the fact is that it's not just about repurposing things, cutting corners, solving basic Indian problems. It's also things like looking at the opportunities in meeting, for example, previously overlooked demand. C.K. Prahlad told us about the bottom of the pyramid. And it's very interesting that we had, for example, the realization by Indian companies that there are many people in our country who are poor, but who can still be consumers. So the poor person may not be able to buy a bottle of shampoo, but if you can sell them shampoo in a sachet for 5 rupees, which they can use in 1 or 2 applications, there are people who will buy them. And that discovery has actually been a remarkable Indian innovation, subsequently copied in Africa and many other places. So a market for a product that it had always been assumed the poor couldn't buy. And so the realization that the poor can be consumers has been very, very instructive. And so India's frugal innovation has often involved actually starting with the needs of poor consumers and working backwards. So whereas in the West, for example, people invent a product and then complicate it or refine it or make it smaller or fancier or more expensive, Indian innovators often find themselves stripping a product down to its bare essentials in order to make such a product affordable, accessible, durable, and effective, and thereby reach a larger market. And I think it's important for us to recognize that Indian ingenuity has produced a startling number of world-beating innovations in recent years. I don't hold any brief for the Tatas, by the way, any shares with them. We all know that Tata Nano was a marketing disaster in this country. That when you try and sell a car as the cheapest car, how many people want to be seen driving the cheapest car? They'd rather buy the more expensive motorbike. But the truth is that if you just look at it as a product, the Tata Nano at the equivalent to $2,000 costs roughly the same as a high-end DVD player in a luxury Western car. But of course, there's no DVD player in the Nano, no radio either on the basic model. But its innovations have gathered 34 patents. And they're not merely the result of doing away with frills like air conditioning, power brakes, side view mirrors, and so on, but things like reducing the use of steel by inventing an aluminum engine, increasing space by moving the wheels to the edge of the chassis, relying on a modular design that enables the car to be assembled from kits. All of this has demonstrated conclusively that Indian entrepreneurship can succeed by doing more with less. Similarly, jugaad has been criticized very often for being essentially a way of cutting corners, pirating products, or making cheap imitations of global brands. I would disagree. I think Indian entrepreneurs have shown that you can, through the approaches of Jugaad, actually facilitate innovation. Find inexpensive solutions, which are indeed often improvised ones, within the constraints of a resource-starved developing country. Now, the classic Jugaad is the Indian farmer or villager who takes a bullock cart and puts an irrigation hand pump on it as an engine and using it to transport his goods or his livestock. That's the kind of individual entrepreneurship that Indians are credited with. But even that shows a certain level of imagination. Common machines and household objects, for example, are reincarnated in ways that their original manufacturers never intended. Everything is reusable or imagined. I had this wonderful picture of a washing machine being repurposed in a Punjabi dhaba to make industrial sized quantities of lassi. And why not? Imagine if you have 100 thirsty people crowding around your shop on a hot summer's day and you have to go through them in a normal blender. How long it'll take you? Why do you need to do that? Washing machine will serve the same purpose. And I've actually seen a video of this, the washing machine lassi maker. Or even more basic. I think those of us who are parents here will know the value of the great Indian invention called the missed call. Right? So if you have a mobile phone but you can't afford to pay the bill, you just have a deal with your friend or your parent or whoever else it is that one ring or two rings and switching off means that they have to call you back at their expense. But we can also go on more seriously to other kinds of creative products, things like the GE Mac 400, a handheld electrocardiogram device that costs basically $800, which is striking because the cheapest ECG available anywhere in the world outside India is $2,000. Or the Tata Swatch, this water filter, which at about $24 in today's exchange rate is about 10 times cheaper than its nearest competitor. And if you take that electrocardiogram, this uses just 4 buttons instead of the usual dozen. It has a tiny portable printer that looks like the ones that these waiters will now bring you for your credit card in a restaurant, making it small enough to fit into a knapsack or a satchel. And it's also capable of running on batteries. So if you're using your ECG in some poor rural area where the power supply is gone or is non-existent, it can work. But the most striking thing is the cost of an ECG today in this GE Mac 400 is about $1 per patient. Now that means that in a country where about 5 million Indians are dying of cardiovascular diseases every year, this simple bit of entrepreneurial innovation can save thousands of lives. And let's face it, a poor person who's worried about his heart can afford that 60 rupee ECG, whereas he could not have afforded the 2,500 rupee ECG without thinking about it several times over and sometimes too late. Or that water filter, the Swatch, they're using rice husks, which is such a common waste product in our paddy fields in Kerala. If you use those rice husks, you can actually effectively purify water. And what's striking is that, again, we are a country where 2 million people are estimated to die every year from drinking contaminated water. So once again, entrepreneurship of a very simple Jugaad kind of approach is actually saving Indian lives. Many other examples of frugal innovation are there. I don't want to single out some manufacturers over others. But there's a low-cost, fuel-efficient mini truck. I think there's an inexpensive mini tractor that's being sold. Mahindra designed it here, makes it in China, sells it in the US. A battery-powered refrigerator for the rural areas, particularly for our rural pharmacies, primary healthcare centers, to keep medicines cool enough and so on. We make the world's cheapest solar lamps, even cheaper than China, at about $12 and so on. An Indian company, a biotech company, invented the world's cheapest hepatitis B vaccine. Before this Indian company got into the game, the cheapest hepatitis B vaccine in America cost $15 per injection. Today, the Indian equivalent costs 10 US cents. So that's the kind of transformation that has happened. Insulin's price globally has fallen by about 40% thanks to an Indian entrepreneur who has invented a cheaper insulin. A Bangalore company's diagnostic tool to test for tuberculosis and infectious diseases comes in at about $200 in global prices, whereas the comparable equipment in the West comes in not at $2,000 but at $10,000. So that's the kind of differential that an Indian entrepreneur can make. So it's not just a question of serving the poor consumer in India, it's really creating a product that can revolutionize global pricing. And so solving some of these problems in an interesting way. Even the financial sector, for example. After all, we had a country just a few years ago when UPA 2 began, we had about 15 million bank accounts in a country of 1.2 billion people. And Dr. Manmohan Singh started this process of opening, of extending banking services. The first idea was that if people won't come to banks, and the bank should go to the people. So we created all these correspondents, these banks of these groups, these brigades of traveling tellers with handheld devices who entered into the sort of homes of villagers and thatched huts, essentially taking the branch to the village home, taking deposits as low as 50 rupees. And of course, in addition to that, the thrust by both the UPA government and subsequently by the NDA government, which used the catchy term Jan Dhan, saw 175 million bank accounts between 2012 and 2015. So 2 years of UPA and 1 of NDA. We saw that, and I'm sure the figures have gone up further since 2015. So entrepreneurship in various forms has pervaded the Indian economy, and it's one reason why there is much more dynamism in the Indian economy than those who look only at the macroeconomic data believe. We always complain about seeing the wood and missing the trees. Sometimes it is important to really focus on these individual trees to see that the forest is basically healthy. In 2014, NASSCOM, I think Chandrasekhar is here, has predicted that by 2020, India would have more than 2 lakh people working for startups. At that point, when he made that prediction, when NASSCOM said that, India had about 65,000. And if you're going to have about 11,000 startup firms by 2020, then clearly entrepreneurship is on the upswing. Ironically, one could argue this cannot really be done without the support of the state. We've got the Startup India scheme. I'm not quite sure, maybe it's too early to tell whether it's working well and how well it's working. But it certainly could be supplemented. In the debate in Parliament on the budget, I pointed out to our finance minister that in ideas like telling entrepreneurs that for the first 3 years you'll have a tax holiday is not particularly helpful, because very few entrepreneurs make a profit in their first 3 years. So they're not going to be able to save much in taxes. But if you can give tax incentives to angel investors to actually help struggling young entrepreneurs to get a start, then you may actually make a bigger difference. That's one of the arguments that I found the government somewhat impervious to. There's a larger argument. The Honorable Prime Minister of Israel, a country famous for its entrepreneurship, environment, and startup culture, stated, this is Benjamin Netanyahu, that it's not just the economy of a country, but its culture that enables the process of entrepreneurship. He was talking about his own country. In our country, we have to change, therefore, our cultural attitudes, give greater impetus to entrepreneurship, and strengthen the budding culture that encourages and nurtures this kind of approach. And Kerala, in particular, has a challenge to overcome. We have a peculiar situation in Kerala, which is not as true anywhere else, which is that the Keralite is tremendously entrepreneurial abroad and completely state-dependent at home. So it was always assumed. I remember when I was a kid and Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, my father's friends laughing and saying there must have been a chayakadakaran who gave him a cup of tea when he landed there. There'll always be a Malayali who got there first. And the ubiquity of Malayalis in every other country, all running shops and running ventures, has suggested that there is strong entrepreneurial spirit. But within the state, we haven't really got that. And that's where I think some of the efforts made by the previous Kerala government have been valuable, because they've sought deliberately to encourage the culture of entrepreneurship. The Kerala Startup Mission, established by the Oommen Chandy government, provides a common platform for startup incubators, investors and innovators to come together. In my own constituency of Thiruvananthapuram, we started a project called I Am an Entrepreneur, which I launched in the Technopark. It was an effort at providing guidance and assistance to startups and at the same time encouraging entrepreneurs to come and pitch good ideas. And then the best half a dozen or so were given simple facilities, an office, a few computers, an assistant, some seed capital to bring their ventures to fruition. I think one of the great satisfactions is that some of the early ones who came and participated now are running actual viable, thriving businesses in the same Technopark, and they're renting offices now instead of using an incubation facility. This required the support of the Department of Science and Technology and the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research. So the government can take credit for having nurtured these budding seeds. The campaign aimed at identifying and promoting entrepreneurial talent in Kerala and brought young minds together to pursue this. And I think we should have more such incubation centers right across the state. There are, of course, undoubtedly a number of economic and socio-political challenges in this state that we must address if we are truly to develop an entrepreneurial culture and make Kerala the next entrepreneurial hub, as this conference hopes to propound. The fact is, we tell ourselves and the public and all the tourists that we are God's own country, but many business leaders and entrepreneurs I've spoken to seem to see us as the devil's own backyard. So there is a great deal that we need to correct. We have human development levels akin to a first world country. We have a proud tradition of political rights and liberties. We do welcome outsiders, as we've done for 3,000 years. We have the country's highest literacy rates. We ensure that women in our state lead empowered lives, though we don't seem to put them on our stages at an entrepreneurial conference. All of these successes of policy making and leadership are important, but they still mask certain critical economic challenges that come in the way of the objective of this TiECON conference. First is that Kerala staggers under a debt ratio of 28.5%, which is the highest in southern India and one of the very highest in the country. We have to accept that's impossible to sustain in the long run. Second, the main drivers of economic growth in the state have been the service and construction sectors, which together contribute 81% to our net state domestic product. This also means, however, that the contributions of industry and agriculture have been marginal. So entrepreneurship is coming in at a very small industrial base. There was a recent ease of doing business survey conducted by the Niti Aayog, and it's interesting because ease of doing business has become such a buzzword these days that somebody sent me a cartoon of a well-known traditional laxative saying, promoting ease of doing business for the last 2,000 years. But the fact is that ease of doing business has to be taken seriously. And there, we have come out in the Niti Aayog survey as one of the worst performing states in the country. A couple of figures I think are not unfamiliar to all of you. On average, it takes 180 days to set up a business in India, which is why we are only 100th in the world in ease of doing business. But in Kerala, setting up a business takes more than double that, 214 working days. Even construction permits, which is why India is one of the worst in the world for speed of construction permits, because India nationally requires 112 days. Kerala manages to beat that record also. In Kerala, it takes 134 days to get a construction permit. Then there is a grave overdependence on remittances, 25% of the state's revenues compared to only 3% for India as a whole. So we've got these 2.2 million Keralites working in the oil-rich Gulf states. We're very proud of them. But we also realize that if it rains in the Gulf, we'll catch cold in Kerala. I mean, the fact is that we've taken the sunshine in the Gulf for granted a very long time. But as the Kuwait crisis demonstrated, and as the Bahrain crisis nearly demonstrated, there is a fragile base there. Things could go wrong. And if there was a sudden exodus of those 2.2 million Keralites, not only would we be unable to absorb them and find productive work for them, but equally seriously, we would not be able to do without the remittances they're sending us. The remittance level, according to the State Planning Board, reached 60,000 crores in 2015. And apparently it's been soaring by about 17% in each fiscal year, according to data collected by the State Level Bankers Committee. So as a result, because of all this money coming in from the remittances, we have high income, we have amongst the highest per capita incomes in the country, rapid growth, and strong social indicators, which coexist with high unemployment and a slim manufacturing and industrial base. So let's face it, our economy would essentially crumble without the Gulf. And we forget that the problems that led our people to go and flourish in the Gulf were actually problems, that Kerala's jobless lakhs had been moving through the gaps in the Ghats to every nook and corner of the rest of the country before the Gulf boom in the early 70s in search of employment and economic freedom. So we have things we need to fix here if we are to be able to overcome this overdependence. Despite all of this, despite exporting so much of our labor, we have an average unemployment rate of 7.4%. And if you want to know India's national average, it's only 2.3%. So, of course, under the NDA government, it's gone up from there. So my figure is a couple of years out of date. I think the latest figure I saw is in manufacturing and industry, the unemployment rate's about 5%. But still, Kerala is extremely high, and it afflicts primarily the educated and the skilled. There has been an influx of migrant labor from far-off states to do jobs that Keralites are unwilling to do. And I think the last estimate I saw is there are 32 lakh migrant laborers in Kerala to fill unskilled jobs that unemployed Keralites are unwilling to do. So you can imagine the social indicators that we would have to face if we had even more people coming back who are used to a certain standard of employment and living in the Gulf and who will not find that work here. So this alarming situation stands at the heart of the socio-political challenges we face in Kerala. The attitude of the workforce is something that many entrepreneurs have complained about. And it's particularly striking that Keralites put in long hours in places like the Gulf. They've earned a reputation for being hardworking and utterly reliable. I have spoken to Arab ministers in countries like Bahrain and Kuwait who tell me, don't send any Bangladeshis, we won't give them visas, send us Keralites, they're the ones who work hard. That's the reputation that Keralites have. But in Kerala, the reputation is slightly different. They're very often seen as indolent and strike-prone. I'm always struck by that reputation because it is unquestionably true. A former staff member of mine was recounting a train journey he took across Tamil Nadu to come to Kerala. And he was recounting how early in the morning, as the sun rose, looking out of his train window, he could see in these houses in Tamil Nadu, people scurrying to get ready, leaving the house with their briefcases or their furled up umbrellas or whatever. And then half an hour later, 45 minutes later, the train would cross the border and come into Kerala. And there you would find people are just waking up, they're sitting on their porch with the newspaper and a cup of tea. This is very much the culture. And of course, let's face it, because we do need to face reality, the politicized environment at home hasn't helped. We are still the only state that clings to the outmoded form of protest called the hartal. Nowhere else in India now are there hartals except Kerala, but they happen, I think 65 have taken place so far this year. And it's a disgrace. It really is an absolute disgrace that hartals and strikes have led to so many entrepreneurs having to petition the state government for protection from political parties coming and stirring up their workers to stop work. I remember one story from the previous Oman Chandi government, the first one, when that government persuaded BMW to install a car manufacturing plant in the state, with giving lots of generous tax concessions. And the very day that BMW arrived, the executives arrived to sign the deal, there was a Kerala hartal, a statewide bandh. some marginal political issue, but these executives came from Germany and they saw cars were being blocked on the streets, shops were being closed by hartal. Anyone who was daring to drive out on the street, air was being forced out of his tires, stones were being thrown at his windshield. And though the issue had nothing to do with either foreign investment or BMW, the executives didn't sign that day. They beat a hasty retreat and went and set up the plant in Tamil Nadu. Now, this kind of story is something that truly worries me. If you're looking at 65 hartals, oh, by the way, the figure was not up to today. The figure was only up to the end of June. So that's about one hartal every 3 days, somewhere or the other in the state. That is not going to be something that induces entrepreneurial success and that induces capital to come in here. Especially when the average of 100 hartals a year costs the state over 2,000 crores annually, we have a real challenge. Now, having given you the bad news, because as Rajesh said in his address, we've all heard all the bad news already, so let's not dwell on that. Let's focus on the good news. I began, as you know, with mainly good news, then went into bad news so no one can accuse me of being unrealistic today. Let me end with some good news. It's striking, since we are now ruled by a communist government, which constantly draws great inspiration from Cuba, that Cuba is, of course, the country with the best patient-to-doctor ratios in the world. And yet it was a country that for generations languished under severe economic sanctions imposed by its nearest and biggest neighbor, the US, has very limited resources, a modest GDP. But the WHO has declared Cuba to be a role model on issues concerning healthcare, particularly in regard to affordability and accessibility. Cuba has a lower infant mortality rate than the US at 4.2 per thousand. It has a life expectancy rate of 78. The US is 79, I think. But of course, its average expenditure on healthcare in American dollars is $813 per person, as opposed to $9,500 per person in the US. So what Cuba did was to provide the political leadership, even within a communist system, a healthy entrepreneurial climate to healthcare, and focused on primary healthcare and preventive care. They made healthcare a human right in Cuba's constitution. They made access to healthcare universal and free, and they sponsored all medical education. So they were able to export doctors to various third world countries and as well create a medical tourism industry before we did so in India. So one can have many differences with the communist ideology of the Cuban government, but one has to concede they've developed a world-class health infrastructure. So it shows that even in a resource-strained environment, and arguably even with sort of a 19th century ideology ruling, they were able to create 21st century desirable levels of access to affordable healthcare. Now, Kerala in health is trying to head in the same direction, though we still have many challenges. And as we all know, and Dr. Azad Mupan is an example of this, the private sector is doing far more impressive work in healthcare in our state so far than the government sector. But still, the government sector in many areas of what one might call entrepreneurial activity is not lagging far behind. I met a few years ago a gentleman who must be known to some of you because he was based in Cochin for a while, a Malayali from the Bahamas called Anthony Prince. He's a president of a major ship designing company there, GTR Campbell. GTR Campbell was founded, of course, by a Scotsman. That was his name. Anthony Prince was his hardest working, most loyal employee. He rose to number 2 of the company, and when Mr. Campbell passed on, he passed his company to Anthony Prince. So GTR Campbell had built many ships around the world over decades. In fact, GTR Campbell is a company singularly credited with reviving China's Xingang shipyard. And when Prince took over, he thought, if I can do this in China for my company, why can't I do it in India? So everyone advised him against it. Everyone said, you can't possibly go to Kerala because there'll be strikes every second day, nothing will work. They make a huge trader class double hulk bulk carrier, and he decided he was going to get one of them built at the Cochin shipyard. This is about 10 years ago now. So it was a major undertaking because the GTRC trader class ship is 30,000 tons deadweight. It has a cargo hold of 40,000 cubic meters in capacity. And those ships are supposed to have a capacity of sailing over 15,500 nautical miles. So it's a huge ship, big engine room, big engines, big bulk, etc. Certainly it would have challenged any experienced shipyard anywhere in the world. But as the work unfolded, Prince told me, he realized he need not have worried. Not only was there not a single strike or work stoppage, but the shipyard workers took great pride in the fact that they'd been given such a major assignment. They finished the job to GTRC's complete satisfaction, and they did so ahead of deadline. And the story has a happy ending because then 5 more ships were built by GTRC in Cochin. It was the shipyard's largest ever order, and they would have given more except the shipyard ran out of capacity. And because they also had a pending order from the Indian Navy to build a huge aircraft carrier, and that was the end of that. But the fact that they could do it is itself an advertisement for the Kerala workforce and for the entrepreneurial spirit here. And so what he was saying to me, Mr. Prince, was that the officers and the workers in this Kerala shipyard proved they could do it. They launched the first vessel on schedule. There was first-rate quality. They met all the international shipbuilding standards. And he said, I hope the message will spread and more foreign companies like his will come and make ships in India. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but I think we need to be able to promote this message. It's a highly labor-intensive industry, shipbuilding, and 30% of the input into a ship is human labor. So a country like India, and particularly a place like Kerala with a 7.4% unemployment, ought to be able to embrace a business like shipbuilding. And what's interesting is, of course, that every worker in Cochin shipyard is unionized. It's not that this is Chinese-style, government-controlled labor, but they were able to demonstrate that proud, motivated labor is a great asset and not a liability. I'm going to be a little parochial and also speak about the entrepreneurship at Trivandrum's Technopark, both because I mentioned the I Am an Entrepreneur project, which took off rather well, but also the existing enterprises that came into Technopark. Vijay Raghavan, who established it, is sitting right here. He'll have even better stories to tell you. But when Technopark came into being, there was understandably some skepticism as to whether Kerala was able to, and it was the first Technopark in the country. They came in, and one of the interesting things is that I keep hearing from CEOs, many of whom are not Keralites, of their really satisfaction. They tell me in glowing terms of their satisfaction with the work environment in Kerala, the quality of the local engineering graduates, and of course the beauty of the lush and tranquil surroundings. The old cliche was that nothing succeeds like success. In some ways in Kerala, nothing succeeds like failure also, because our failure to attract and retain industry means we are the one place in India with breathable air. There isn't all this industrial smoke and pollution clogging up our air. So we actually have a technopark that's a joy to work in. And I think US Technologies, Alexander Verghese may be here today. He had told me a story years ago, which I love telling, because his firm bid for a contract. I think it was with a Houston or Dallas-based company for a software project that they could develop. And the company wrote saying, well, we've added you to the shortlist of Indian companies at a bid, but you're number 6 on the shortlist. We have some bigger names than you. We'll go and see them first. So these executives came through, they came from America, flew down to India, and then they spent 5 or 6 harrowing days inspecting the other companies in places like Gurgaon and Bangalore and Hyderabad, trying to plow through the traffic congestion, choking on the air pollution. And then they arrived in Thiruvananthapuram, checked into the beach, the Leela, I think it was, at Kovalam Beach, sipped a drink by the seaside at sunset, came to this lush green technopark in less than 20 minutes drive on a 4-lane highway, saw the facilities and voted unanimously to give the contract to the Thiruvananthapuram company. They said, if we have to visit India from time to time to see how our contract is doing, we'd rather visit Kerala than any other place in India. So that, I think, is our big strength. How can we attract entrepreneurial investment? We can do so by selling what we have to sell, which is indeed our environment, our attractive facilities, our skilled labor, and so on. That's the God's own country tag, applying not to tourism, but to entrepreneurship. Of course, tourism remains our other major income generator, and entrepreneurship in tourism is really widespread. I know Jules Dominic is here. He is a pioneer in actually promoting tourism through a different kind of Kerala model, trying to come up with environmentally friendly tourism to tie into this narrative I'm telling you. But the fact is that in Kerala, the potential is absolutely immense, even if we've already had 2 or 3 decades of success in tourism. I've often been saying that Make in India was not the wrong slogan, it was at the wrong time, because by now we are trying to say Make in India for products that no human beings are going to be making anywhere. One of the reasons that big Foxconn announcement of $3 billion investment in India hasn't seen a single foundation being driven into the ground is because Foxconn has probably woken up and realized that robots can do it cheaper even than Indian workers. So I think Make in India is in trouble, no question about that. But instead of Make in India, if we had said Visit India far more emphatically, we might have actually done well, because global tourism studies have demonstrated that $1,000 invested in the tourist industry will actually employ 8 times the number of people that $1,000 invested in manufacturing can employ. So, and the great strength of tourism is it can employ semi-skilled and even unskilled labor. And so when we look at the unemployment challenges in Kerala, we may not have that many people willing to work on construction sites, which is why we are importing these migrant laborers from Bihar and Orissa. But we will find certainly Keralites willing to work in 5-star hotels or even 4-star and 3-star hotels. And that's what we need to bring more of into Kerala. So I'm hoping that all those, I want to wrap up by saying, my gosh, I'm late for my next event. And as you know, we are all like Egyptian mummies. We are strapped for time. So let me just conclude by saying that it will take the leadership and entrepreneurial skills of those sitting in this room to realize the potential I've sketched for you, whether it is in certain kinds of manufacturing professions like shipbuilding, or whether it's in a labor-intensive activity like tourism. Why should we have a situation where more tourists visit Singapore or Dubai in a week than visit India in a year? The fact is that these are places that have realized how valuable tourism is to their economy. They've developed the necessary infrastructure to cater to high incoming traffic, and we have not. I remember the frustrations experienced by tourism operators in North Kerala. You have lovely, pristine beaches, you have Bekal Fort, you have the proximity now of the upcoming Kannur airport, and yet the infrastructure is so wretched, and the complete lack of roads, reliable phone connections, and all sorts of problems have made these entrepreneurs tear their hair out saying, the government hasn't given us the support we need. So my own view is the government can chip in, provide the infrastructure, the entrepreneurs can come in with their ideas and their innovations. We have to choose the right areas to target, and then it seems to me we can make ourselves not just God's own country, but God's own country with world-class human-made facilities. That, I think, is vital, and I encourage all of you entrepreneurs in this room today to display your talent and intelligence to set up creative new ventures. I'm absolutely confident, having seen, and I've mentioned a number of names on the stage and off the stage, of the motivated, mature, experienced, and successful individuals who are here today, who will make exceptional contributions to the pool of knowledge and wealth in Kerala, in our country, and in the world. You are the genuine leaders of Kerala, and in your own right, I hope you will carry the weight of the countless, nameless, faceless citizens of our state who will rely on your skill and your dedication and your acquired talent to help build them a better tomorrow. I wish you all a successful conference. All the best. Thank you, and Jai Hind.